Yeah.
Okay, well, our speaker's gone AWOL, but I suspect he will be back in just a moment. And when he gets to connect again, we will get the
Can you
ball
see
rolling.
me? Can you hear me?
There you are. I can hear you.
Yeah, that I'm in a hotel, and usually these hotels have very consistent Wi-Fi, but maybe not. We'll see. It's new.
Well, everybody, welcome to today's special installment of the Math Club. I'm glad you all turned out so late, and I'm especially grateful to our speaker who had to travel all day, but is still willing to give us a talk all the way from the West Coast. So I won't waste any more time because you all want to hear from him and not me. But this is a very good old friend of mine, Dean Oliver, who will be speaking to us about basketball analytics.
And definitely let me know if you sense my connections going in and out. Let me know. Because last time when I apparently froze for you guys, it looked like I was fine. So let me see. I'm hoping I can share screen so I can show you some stuff. Let me know if you can let me share screen. All right. All right. Here we go. Let's see here. All right. Talking basketball analytics. Okay. Yeah. I've known Jim Bob a very long time. In fact, it was my freshman year at Caltech with him and a bunch of other people that I kind of started on this road to basketball analytics. The word analytics didn't exist then, and I think even the definition of what analytics is still a little bit vague. It's such a new term, but I'll walk you through a little bit of what I do, a little bit of how I do it. I do feel extremely fortunate that, frankly, I, I love sports, and I'm really good at math. I've been good at math my whole life. I like being able to apply what I'm good at to what I love doing. So it's a new field, and what I've been saying actually since I got into it, it is one of those things that continues to grow. Certainly sports analytics, and my understanding is the broader analytics around all sorts of industries is growing. So it's a good thing to apply your wisdom, your knowledge to. So yeah, let me give you a little bit of the background. So before I got to high school, I played a ton of sports. Basically anything I could is what I did, is what I loved. There were a few things that I really didn't have access to. I grew up mostly in Hawaii, so there was no ice hockey or anything there. I can tell you that. But I was very good at math, and I certainly thought about a lot of sports mathematically. In high school, certainly I got rewarded for my abilities in a broad spectrum of science and math, that kind of thing. I did play sports, but I definitely gravitated to the things I was a little bit better at, which were, I mean, frankly, distance sports, distance running, that kind of thing. Before high school, I actually lost the sight in my left eye, so I have no natural depth perception, which makes basketball and baseball in particular pretty challenging. So as much as I continued to play them, I couldn't be naturally good at those. Again, always science and sports though in my head. College, going to Caltech, discovered engineering and really applying a lot of math skills to solving problems, and that definitely formed a lot of the way I thought. I was, as I got into Caltech, I was thinking a lot about some of the Bill James work. Bill James did a lot of what's now called analytics in baseball. And I read some of his things in high school. And then when I got to college, as I'll tell you a little bit of story about in the subsequent slide, how I kind of started working on basketball from a scientific math perspective. Playing basketball at Caltech and then moving to the coaching staff my last 2 years gave me an opportunity to really get to know the game from a coaching perspective. Our head coach at Caltech, in fact, had been in Southern California for a very long time and knew a lot of people, including an assistant coach for the Los Angeles Lakers. So when I went to graduate school at University of North Carolina, he said, do you want to be an advanced scout? I know someone for the Lakers who needs coverage out that way. And so I did that. And so at the same time, I was doing a PhD in environmental engineering, stochastic differential equations and this kind of thing. I was also doing basketball. And so pretty much all my school life, I was thinking about sports and thinking about math and science. So it made a lot of sense. When I got done with graduate school and my postdoc, I actually had an opportunity to work with a team, with an NBA team, be a scout. But frankly, it paid nothing. It paid very little. It wasn't, I didn't want to go out and make $25,000 a year after going through graduate school and getting to be good at math. So I joined an environmental consulting firm, better pay than that. And I knew I wouldn't give up basketball. I knew it was something that was always fun to me. I knew I had some ideas here, and frankly, in graduate school and as I became an engineer, I developed some of the theory behind applying probabilistic things to basketball in ways that I hadn't seen in literature or anything like that. So when I really started looking into some of the literature on sports. During that period, that was when the internet kind of began too. World Wide Web began in 1995 or so for some of us. That's when I first saw it. I think actually 93 was when I first saw it. But I put together what would be called a blog now, but back then that word didn't exist, writing about basketball and math. It was called the Journal of Basketball Studies. In fact, that still exists to this day with some of the articles that I posted way back in 95. That was when I really learned to write because I had to express it to a lot of people. And frankly, in 1995 and 1996, there were a countable number of websites around. And so I was actually one of the most popular websites in 95 and 96 because there just weren't that many out there. And so I was writing to a fairly broad audience at that point. In 2002, I took time off from my job as an engineer to write a book. The book is called Basketball on Paper. And that decision was one of the riskiest things I've ever done, but also one of the best decisions I ever made. To take time off and write a book about math and basketball was kind of crazy. My coworkers thought I was crazy. And then when the book came out and I said I'm quitting to chase a job in the NBA, they thought I was so crazy. They were coming up with other reasons they thought were the real reasons for why I quit. It was a leap of faith. There were no jobs in the NBA to do analytics. That word still didn't exist at that point. So my first job came working with the Seattle Supersonics when they existed. And they gave me a job paying very little, but the opportunity to prove myself. And I had enough. And my first year there with a part of a coaching staff that was kind of receptive, I was able to show how it could basically ground everybody's eyes. So the way basketball works is people watch the game and they think they understand it with their eyes. And numbers were a way to ground that knowledge for them. And so we did very, very well. And they sold the team, so I ended up moving to another team. I was in Denver for many years until the NBA lockout, when ESPN contacted me, and then I worked for a sports media company, starting their analytics group. And so that's when I started being able to work on football. And I spent most of my time at ESPN working on football, probably 70% of it, and then probably 20% on basketball and 10% on other things. So I have a lot of experience in football. In fact, after ESPN, I joined one of the companies called True Media, which provides an interface to ESPN and some of the analytics to ESPN on football. So I have experience on the football side. I won't talk about it a ton directly here, but if that's your sport of choice, feel free to ask about it. I have thought about it a lot. I know a lot. I actually know plenty of people in the business. Football is a lot of fun. So that's some background, how I came about some of this stuff. So what is sports analytics? As I say, we have thrown around this word for so long without a definition, it's kind of crazy. Sports analytics, in my mind, is you're trying to do an analysis of a sports question. In many ways, in my mind, a lot of times that is, the question is how to win. How do we win? And you use numbers to try to get there. I have done this on the team side, and I've done it for media. On the team side, it kind of gets broken down into personnel. How do we evaluate players? How good are they? What can they do for us? What are their roles that they're optimized in? And then there's coaching, which is how do you optimize the players you've got, which is whether through roles, whether through developing their skills, these kind of things. And then on the media side, as I say, I think of sports analytics is asking questions about sports. And I usually think of them about how you win. Well, media's job is to tell a story. And that is really it. And I felt like my job there was to tell the story of how winning happens. And there are tools that media probably uses more than teams. For instance, win probability. What's the chance that a team is going to win at any point in the game is much more popular in the media than it is on a team basis. People like looking at things like that. But just so you understand, there's a broad applicability to some of sports analytics. There's a number of different questions, and I'm going to highlight some of those as we go along. So let me tell you how this started. So Jim Bob and I were in a house called Page House at Caltech. And in the lounge, there was a TV, a couch, another, I guess, a love seat, and there was a pit and a fireplace. And at the end of finals, I had finished finals with a few days left to go, and there was an NBA finals game on TV, the Lakers and the Celtics. And okay, I'm done. I don't have to really do anything, but let me sit down here with my notepad and just write down what's going on. And so I did. And that day, my freshman year, kind of changed the path of my life. This is kind of a representation of a game that I did years later, but still illustrates a little bit of what's going on. On the left side, this is the running score between Chicago and Utah. And then these are jersey numbers as you kind of proceed left to right. And there's different symbols that I added for it. D means that they dribbled the ball. Slash meant that they crossed half court. Here's another D. The plus means that they made a shot. And 2 indicates a region of the court where they shot that. And in the first time I did this, I didn't have all of these things, but I had the basics of this. Basically following where the ball went, moving on to a new line when the other team got possession, and just keeping track of what was going on. And for me, it was just a natural application of being a student, taking notes and seeing what was going on in a game. And so this provided a natural structure to sports that really didn't exist. So you'll notice a few things here. First of all, alternating possessions. Basically, each team has a possession, and then the other team has a possession, and it just alternates. You can also see that some of these lines end with a shot. So this is a made shot. So Utah would take over. This is a missed shot, and then Chicago would take over on a defensive rebound. It's one way that one of the lines can end. This is a situation where a turnover ended a possession. And then it also ends with a foul shot. So that's how it can end. And then there are situations where you miss a shot, but there's an offensive rebound that keeps the possession alive, keeps me writing on the same line. And with that came a natural, as I say, there was a structure in the alternating possessions. If you add up like all the possessions that were there, you come up with 17. And if you add up the field goal attempts, which ended some lines, you subtract off the offensive rebounds, you add the turnovers, and you give some fraction of the free throw attempts, that's a good estimate for what was going on in there. And this formula that I figured out in June of '87 was, and in many ways still is, critical in evaluating basketball. It's used at NBA level all the way down to high school and below that at this point, where it's getting used. Just that formula, and I'll highlight where that formula is actually much more important than just as an estimate in a little bit here. So what it does, what possessions do that wasn't done before, people evaluated offense based upon how many points you scored and evaluated defense based on how many points you allowed. What this does is it identifies how many opportunities there are. So coming from Bill James's work on baseball, he always said that you have to score more runs than the other guys based on 27 outs. You have 9 innings and 3 outs an inning, and that's your opportunities to score more runs than the other guys. In basketball, it was 48 minutes or 40 minutes at the college level, or less in certain other levels. And that was useful, but possessions are actually they're more equivalent to the outs that are in baseball. That's the opportunity that you use. So evaluating offense went from points per essentially game, or points per 48 minutes, to points per possession. And so what I did back in '87 was I called these ratings offensive ratings and defensive ratings. So it's points per possession times 100, so that it looks a little bit more like how many points are scored in a game, because there are about 100 possessions per team in a game. I actually published this in Basketball Digest in 1988, and in 88 or 89, and then again in 1990. In the first time I really ever published anything on this sort of thing. So it was way back then that this got started. So as I say, that this gives ratings that are now commonly used. They're on NBA.com. ESPN does this stuff. These are the rankings of some of the top teams from last year. Offensive rating for Milwaukee. They were second in offensive rating. They were first in defensive rating. Dallas was the best offensive team in terms of points per 100 possessions. They were 15th in defense, and so forth. So these lists are now created on a regular basis. The advantage that I had 30 years ago in working with these, being the only person who know them, is now gone. It's now everybody understands this kind of thing. It's a useful tool out there for grounding you on how good offenses and defenses are. I can tell you that there's still plenty of people in basketball who aren't used to this. Even though we've made a lot of ground, there's still plenty of people who don't understand this. They understand it after you explain it to them, but you go through it and explain really the benefit is that you alternate possessions. And for fast teams that may not be very good, they will put up a lot of points, but they're not that efficient. And basketball people usually get that. So this is out there. So I had this a long time ago, but the natural question when you're looking at how good an offense is and how good a defense is why. Why is Milwaukee number 2? Why is Dallas number 1 on offense? Why is Milwaukee the best in defense? And frankly, that came from the estimate. This estimate that I put together, you'd think, in fact, all I thought of it was originally was an estimate of how many possessions that were in the game. But it turns out to be much more important than that. Because if you break it down into the 4 different components of this equation, that first one represents shooting. Remember, you end a possession with a shot. Whether you make it or miss it is the first and the most important, frankly, aspect of how you break down a team. The second component, turnovers, how often you turn it over. That's an important component. Um, Getting to the foul line and offensive rebounds. These are what are now called the four factors. So if you want to understand why a team is good in offense or good in defense, these four factors that are shown here, effective field goal percentage, turnover percentage, free throw rate, and offensive rebounding percentage, they explain it. That is what explain, like there's, you can dig deeper into each of these, but those are the four things that explain how good you are on offense or defense. And that was kind of a fundamental thing. It's probably, say, the thing I'm most known for, was figuring out just from this equation itself that that's how you break it down. So now with those ratings and like, okay, these were how good they are. I'll explain why. So you can look at Milwaukee being number 2 on offense. Well, they were first in shooting. They were 8th in turnover percentage, 18th in offensive rebounding percentage, and 12th in free throw rate. And so this is your explanation for these ratings. And you're going to do the same thing on the defensive side. Milwaukee being number 1 in defense, their shooting, defensive shooting, they allowed the lowest percentage in the NBA. And they also allowed the lowest offensive rebounding percentage and so forth. So it gives you a way to break it down that didn't exist before. One of the things that is actually still a little bit controversial is how important are each of these factors, shooting, turnovers, rebounds, and the foul line. Part of the reason there's a little bit of controversy is because of this word. What is important? How do we define what importance means? And I will say that that's actually a common problem in this field. People talk about basketball, but they don't define terms like we do in science all the time. We define things to be very specific. This concept of what makes something important in sports is not super well defined. But the good thing is most methodologies will generally have things kind of in this range. On a scale from 0 to 10, shooting is always the most important thing. There is one team in the history of all the analyses I've ever done where shooting was not the most important factor for them. And I don't know how many basketball fans we have in this group. We have a lot of basketball fans. Do we have anybody who cares about D3 basketball, D2 basketball? So there is a Division III school in Iowa called Grinnell College. Anybody heard of them? So Grinnell, they were actually in the news this past week. They play what's called the system, and they trap all game long. They play 15 guys all the time. People come in for 2-minute stints at a time. They trap. They try to force a turnover. They will shoot threes and layups. They will never take a mid-range shot. They are the only team I have ever seen where turnovers are actually more important than shooting. And it's only true on the defensive side for them. So if they aren't forcing turnovers, their defense is in big trouble. And that is the only exception I have ever seen where shooting is not the most important. But in general, these numbers, turnovers and rebounds are anywhere from 35 to like 35%, 60% of the importance of shooting, depending on how you kind of make this translation of importance to a number. And then getting to the foul line, even though we all think of it as important, and I can tell you from working with teams, there's a lot of time spent on working on free throws, but free throws are not super important. It's not as though you can ignore them, that's for sure. But we think of it as pretty important, but it's the least important of the four factors, for sure. That all make sense? I can pause here. there's any questions or anything that people want to go through, but certainly can proceed.
So it seems that the amount, like this formula should be weighted based on the strategy that the players are using.
Not this formula, because this formula is just an estimate of possessions. What you're talking about is, so for instance, and this has been done many times at this point, people will do regressions of how efficient a team is, their offensive rating as a function of effective field goal percentage, turnover percentage, rebounds, and foul line. And that will come out with weights, basically, that go on those. And a lot of times those weights are what people assign to be the importance. And when I say that there's different ways to do it, sometimes people apply this at the season level. Sometimes they do it at the game level. Sometimes you can do it at a level much different than all of that. And you will get somewhat different weights based upon that sort of thing. All make sense? Cool.
So this formula is applied to the team as a whole.
Yep.
Does anybody attempt to apply this to the individual player?
Individual, yeah. Let me do this. So, individual player is a little bit different, and this is actually some of the more interesting and challenging work that is out there. So, yes, what happens is those are all team stats that you're pulling in. In an individual case, of course, you are part of a team, and there's only one ball. And so roughly on average, of course, 20% of the shots are yours, 20% of the turnovers are yours. But really how those get split up turn into kind of the most important element of this. And I'll talk about it a little bit here because I think it is one of the more interesting and challenging math problems that I've worked on here. In particular, there's this, what people call the usage efficiency curve. So what percentage of the team's possessions do you use and how efficient are you with those? Get at a little bit of what you're talking about with that equation. So if this is the total team possessions, you have to divide these up into the individual credit for all of those. And division of credit is this whole other mathematical problem. It's a conceptual problem and a mathematical problem that I've put a framework to that I will also kind of get at. Division of credit and blame are very different things. And this is actually getting at some of the most, in my mind, some of the most fun math stuff. So if my basketball brain is doing this stuff, the concept of how we divide credit among teammates is really hard, but really cool. So I'll talk about some of that. Let me back up, and this will set some things up, I think, a little bit too. So I talked about those 4 factors, and they explain everything. But one of the things you can do is you can break down each of those factors in a little bit more detail. So shooting, for instance, is being the most important thing. People talk about now in basketball, they talk about shooting layups and threes, and you got to avoid the mid-range. It's talked about a lot. There's an overgeneralization to that and frankly, a lot of people don't understand game theory. It's like, yeah, it's even if one thing is less efficient, it doesn't mean you do it never. And especially where you have a defense trying to counter everything that you're doing. So we can measure some of these things. It's useful. There are these, understanding more of the why is who's on court and who is off court. There are methods talking about that use just this information, who is on court and the team ratings while they're on the court or off the court to evaluate how good a player is. It's a large scale regression problem. And it's considered good, but also extremely noisy. The results from those kind of regressions give error bars that, I mean, frankly, can be extremely large, especially when a lot of players play the same minutes together. So they don't play with other players as much. You end up with some of those problems. There's also some elements of this where there's different times of the game. Normal basketball game time is when both teams are being very competitive. But there is garbage time. There's time basically when, you know, the team is ahead by 25 with 3 minutes left to go. They're not playing as hard. And you have to account for this. Motivation definitely matters in basketball. Emotion and motivation and their impacts on be measured. But I won't even get into all of the details of this, but I'm throwing out a lot of the stuff that we have been able to measure and talk about. So this is returning to this question of individuals and players. I mentioned that there is a method out there just looking at how well the team is doing with players on the floor, offense and defense, and you can use a regression type technique to evaluate how good the player is and how many points they're adding and or taking away based upon how good or bad they are. But that is a regression type approach that I've used, I like for some things. It's noisy. On the other hand, there is a lot of theory about usage versus efficiency. If players are shooting a lot of shots, they're probably shooting worse shots the more shots that they're taking. It's kind of an economic concept. And it was one of the most strangely, one of the most controversial statements I have ever made. There were a lot of people who completely disagreed with me. And I think people have come more to this approach, but it is understanding this trade-off between efficiency and usage is a great mathematical problem on its own. There is how good is a player if they are shooting on a 5-man team. If a player is shooting half the shots, they're going to score a lot of points, even if they're inefficient. How good is that player? Like, is that player better than the player who's super efficient, makes most of his shots, but is only taking 10, 15% of the shots? That was, frankly, an unresolved problem for a long time. And I actually think, I mean, some of the stuff that I've done is not actually all out there to show what that balance is. And it's not a simple problem. Frankly, this is kind of getting at the economic problem of marginal utility and how valuable are laborers in their terminology. Their work is kind of a subset of this. So if you have a team of 5 people, it's different. If you have an infinite team, if you have a team of, say, like once you get up to like 30 or 100, your opportunity cost effectively goes negligible. But the kind of work that you have to do with a team ends up being very important, and it kind of relates to some of the economic stuff on that side. So I will get at that. Actually, I think the slide after this, but I do want to make one distinction. When we're talking about how good players are, that's people confuse that with how good they will be. So Kevin Durant, people who know basketball know Kevin Durant is future Hall of Famer, one of the best players that's ever played. Kevin Durant was he was drafted into the NBA by the Seattle Supersonics. His first year, he was terrible. He was awful. He couldn't make shots. He really didn't. They played him at the shooting guard position, which he'd never played before. He wasn't getting a lot of rebounds. He was turning the ball over. He was asked to do things that he hadn't done before. He won Rookie of the Year, though. And why did he win Rookie of the Year? It's because people saw how good he would be. And frankly, this is one of the most common communication problems that I see when I talk about players and when I'm working with people is they are looking at how good a player could be or will be. They see potential, and they are fundamentally different problems. Even though Kevin Durant had a terrible rookie year, my projection methods for what he was going to become after that rookie year were that he was going to be a star. I couldn't project that he was going to be one of the best players ever, but I could project that he was going to be a star. And that is another one of the most important kind of things to understand when you're talking about sports. Since so many people are watching sports, people have opinions, and they don't, and frankly, sometimes they're drunk, and they won't necessarily have the most rational take on guys. So you have to say, like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about how good he is now and the fact that the guy went 1 for 15 in this game? Or are we talking about what he could be, what he's likely to be? And that conversation needs to be had more often. Making predictions about players is critical. It's definitely a big part of the job you have, especially when you're working on the front office side. But you always have to reiterate to people, management and the coaching staff, that we're talking about a prediction. And maybe we're talking about a prediction that's next year. Maybe we're talking about what they're going to be 3 years down the road. You have to be clear about these things too, because how management makes decisions about trades and free agency and all of these things depend upon the timeline that you're forecasting. And we are talking about some players who have very short careers, and you almost have to time those things right. So these predictions are mostly what I would say fairly standard statistical methods. Regression techniques, logistic regression, that kind of stuff is very useful. All sorts of different flavors of machine learning, that kind of thing that are out there are pretty good for a lot of this stuff, if you also are measuring player value right, which is not necessarily always the case. So now here's an example of this usage and efficiency curve. So this is actually from 2017. So Russell Westbrook, so Russell Westbrook actually coincidentally plays for the Washington Wizards right now. When I was writing this chapter in the book, which was a couple of years ago, I put this together because Russell Westbrook was a very high usage player. He shot a lot. I believe in this season, he averaged 42% of all possessions. So basically more than the equivalent of 2 players. And he was good. He was MVP. He was incredibly efficient. This chart shows a variety of things. So the green is the data for Russell Westbrook. So for instance, this game here, he used about 30% of the team's possessions, and it looks like he was about an efficiency of 160. So he produced about 160 points per 100 possessions using 30%. This is all the data. And so how do we project how well he will do as he uses more possessions is a difficult problem because of this constraint that we believe it should be monotonically non-increasing, to be specific. It should be declining. So I effectively had to develop a method to do monotonic regression, I guess. And I don't know if I did it the best way, but it works pretty well. And frankly, I don't know if other people have done this right. I don't know if anybody's really ever actually done it. I've never really seen a good reference for monotonic regression. So maybe if someone comes up with something, definitely let me know. But this is non-linear, and it's kind of a piecewise approach to doing it. But it comes up with a map that I found actually to be reasonably predictive in terms of mapping those points there, those green points. So there are times in a season when you're missing players where you have to take more possessions, and there's times in the season where you have to to use less. And this is a pretty good fit to that noisy set of data for how it works. That's part of this curve. The other thing here is this blue line. So that blue line is basically everything to the right of it means you added to the offense. You added points to the offense productively. Anything to the left of it means you took away. So for a usage of 20%, the average player, if they are producing 110 points per 100 possessions, they are neutral. They didn't either add points or take away points. A player who uses only 5%, they have to be up around 140 before they are actually being productive for the team. And you can see it kind of actually goes to an asymptote down here associated with certain elements. So this curve, I could show the one for adding 1 point, adding 2 points, and so forth, but it is asymptotic, and it's associated with basically the spread of talent. So this curve applies in the NBA, and it's different in college. It's different in high school. It's based upon what the average of the league is and the spread of talent in the league, as well as, frankly, how many players are on a team. So if you played 3-on-3, the curve changes, even with the same talent, all sorts of things. So this is an example of, frankly, some of my favorite math that I've done for basketball, where I had to solve these problems in order to answer relevant questions. In order to just value a player, you have to know how to do. You don't have to know. You can do this simple regression thing, but that's really noisy. And this is actually a lot better. Any questions? I'll pause here for any questions or thoughts or complaints.
So, how would you come up? Like, what methods would you use to come up with this usage efficiency curve? Like, how did it come to be?
Which one? The blue one or the red one?
The blue one.
The blue one is actually a theoretical piece of work that I did. It's actually, I think it's about, I want to say it's like a 10 to 20 line proof that kind of gets you there. Starting with the team efficiency and doing some work with understanding the variability of personnel within sports. So
I'm curious how you came up with the red one.
The red one, as I say, is this monotonic regression approach that I had to develop. Basically, kind of looking to minimize error on a piecewise basis with a constraint that things can only get smaller or can't get bigger as you go increasing usage. And that
You
one,
stated, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
You stated that the blue line was based off of the average spread of talent in the NBA. Since that's an average, you start to look at teams such as the 2017 Warriors or the 2020 or 2021 Brooklyn Nets, where they've become super teams with 3 high usage players. How do you calculate for that usage efficiency rating?
It's a good question. It's one that I haven't. So the way this curve is built, it is based upon league variability, not individual team variability. So it implies basically that there is this talent pool that exists out there that you are pulling from. And so that however top heavy you are on that, you're still drawing from this pool of talent out there. And what level is that talent relative to kind of average is how this theory was built. Is there another way to develop this theory so that you may have more heterogeneous pools out there and people may be drawing from multiple pools? I believe that's actually the case. I have kind of drawn up some ideas for how you consider that, but I haven't done the work on that front. It's a way of saying, great question. I don't have a great answer. Anything else? This is fun stuff. I will definitely say that.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
One of the first equations that you showed, which was the one with the four.
Yeah, the
important
point
part.
four. Yep.
Yeah, the big four. Where did the 0.4 come from in that equation?
Yeah, that was a crude estimate that I basically, when I was I just looked at that sheet that I was hand drawn on, and I calculated the actual possessions that were on there, and I put together an estimate, knowing that how possessions ended. And what happens with free throw attempts is a lot of times they come in twos. So I thought it would be close to 0.5, because those would typically end a possession. But what happens is you have technical fouls and you have and ones where someone made a shot and then they get one bonus free throw. And so that naturally lowered the coefficient on the free throws down to about 0.4. Some people have set this at 0.44. I've seen 0.45. I've seen things lower than 0.4, but not for a while. It does depend a little bit on the rules. In college, the rules for when you get a bonus free throw and so forth, they're different than they are in the NBA. So that 0.4, frankly, does change. If you look at, there's a site called kenpom.com. If you like college basketball, kenpom.com is great. Has tons of numbers and everything for college basketball. Really good guy. He charges $20 a year. So a lot of people buy it. And he has done some work for college to estimate what that number should be better to do it better. But it's never going to be perfect because it's an estimate.
I have a quick question. I coach a high school student who is very interested in sports analytics. And so I just kind of wanted to be able to give her some advice. So studying like a lot of statistics and mathematical modeling, are those the types of things that you would recommend?
Yeah, certainly for analytics professionals in general, people are looking at a lot of statistics programs for sure. There are now analytics programs out there. Among the other technical training, I do recommend eventually certainly database stuff and programming. One of the most common things that I find out is if you do something right, people are going to ask you to do it 100 more times. So you want to automate it. So those are some of the most important technical things that I do recommend for students. I certainly, if they love sports, though, one of the non-technical things that I recommend people do is understand the sport from a coaching perspective. Because the most technical, the most analytical people in sports are coaches. And they have questions that they don't necessarily know how to translate into numbers. So if you have a kid who's talented with numbers, that's great, but only if they know how to translate the real questions into numbers.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
So I have a question also. So, you can assign these various metrics to players to try to determine how good they are. To your knowledge, does that go into the thought process when they're recruiting and selecting from drafts and things like this?
Yes. As I say, there's a little bit of difference in the draft and recruitment and those kind of things. Is what you're trying to do is make a prediction for how good they're going to be. But yes, they do. Probably the simplest analytics, probably the analytics that got the most headway in the NBA early on was draft analytics. How do we make better selections in the draft? And before this work, people were making consistent types of mistakes. And the numbers really helped eliminate a lot of those mistakes. So the draft is more efficient now. There's fewer busts. There's still busts, don't get me wrong. But there are fewer ones, especially the ones that can be found with numbers. There are guys who looked good, who were big, maybe had certain skills, but they didn't have skills that translated from college into the NBA. In particular, quickness, which frankly isn't explicitly measured, but is implicitly measured in several college stats.
Do you think that there's so it's just like the kind of science thing where, whenever you measure something, you change it. I mean, do you think there's a danger that, okay, so I'm a college player and I'm really good and I want to be drafted, right? So I look at the way these numbers are created and I do my best to sort of personally maximize this. And then doesn't that kind of mess with, the accuracy of the metric?
We are there. Yes, it has happened. It's certainly, we are starting to see some of the mistakes that are now being made are because of that. Some of the college players and some of the college coaches are setting up their system to maximize some of the stats that make you more draftable. So we're seeing that, and people have to adjust. And I mean, frankly, steals are one of those things that was out there for a long time. Okay, steals are a simple metric that can help decide. Well, simple metrics are the easiest ones to gain. And now we have to develop more complex systems in order to avoid ways of coaches and such gaming the system.
All right.
I have a question, actually.
Sure.
So when you're trying to predict how good a player is going to be, how do you take into account that player's injury history?
If you have enough of it, you can do some things with it. We know that one of the best predictor of future injuries is past injuries. It's less predictable when you're young, but so it ends up being, most of this work has been done at the NBA level. So if you're a 25-year-old who's had a history of injuries in the NBA, it tends to linger in maybe different ways. It's certainly not perfect. And I will say injury metrics, injury analysis is one of the noisiest things that we do. It is hard. If you're getting logistic probabilities of, oh, there's 15% chance of him getting hurt. Well, that doesn't sound that high, but well, it could be higher than everybody else. And it's not great. It's difficult to make decisions with injury stuff, even with analytics, I can tell you that. But it's a good question, because one of the things I said is like, okay, there's teams that use this and there's media that uses this. Another group that actually is doing some of this are insurance firms. Insurance firms are trying to make predictions about whether they should insure players. This happens at the NBA level. It happens in a lot of leagues. And so one of the very important factors for them is making predictions about whether a player will be around and available.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I have one question.
Sure.
So you were talking about how taking a player and trying to predict what they're going to be instead of what they are now.
Yep.
So you have to take a lot of their qualities and kind of quantify what kind of mathematical impact they're going to have. Do some math with it. But everything that I can think of that you can apply a math to would be something that is going to be good now or not good now. So like, what's something that you can apply a number to that might not be good now, but you can tell it's going to be good in the future?
So the prediction elements of this are actually pretty complicated. It is, it's not as though, like the Kevin Durant example, he projected to be good despite shooting 37% or whatever it is as a rookie. And it's not as though you're just making a prediction that you're not using only that 37% to project what he's going to be. You're also using the fact that he took a lot of shots. He took a lot of 3-point shots. You're using a history of players throughout the league who took a lot of shots young and how much they improved. So you're using information about age, experience, and he was very young when he was getting his time. And you're looking at how those interact with some of these other stats that are out there. Is that answering your question?
I think so, yes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's not a simple estimate. If you're shooting 30%, 37% as a rookie, that you're going to shoot something in your second year and fourth year. It's much more complex than that.
When you have a player such as like Russell Westbrook, who in their prime, I don't know if you would consider him still in his prime now, but in his prime was one of the most talented players in the NBA. Since he's never been a highly efficient scorer or a highly efficient, specifically 3-point shooter, is there a cap that teams would put on to how good they rate these players, even though it's like they've shown evidence to be a top player or a player that can carry a team?
Is there a cap? Certainly, there's a lot of subjective work that is still done in the NBA, and I think there are subjective caps that get put on there. Of course, the best way to do this is to do it a little bit more rigorously so that you can understand the history of players and how they develop. Jason Kidd is hold on just a second, I'm about to sneeze here. Jason Kidd is one of the players who is comparable to Russell Westbrook. He couldn't shoot at all for many years in the NBA. And as he matured, he ended up being a very good shooter. And he is one example among a number out there that you try to put into your projection for what Russell Westbrook could be. And so you may come up with a very sophisticated model for what Russell Westbrook could be. You may have subjective people saying, okay, well, I think this is how good he's going to be. And how you bridge that gap. The communication gap is frankly one of, I told people I spend 40% of my time at least on the communication aspect of this. How do we get everybody on the same page? How people in my business, their job is not to be good at math. If I try to explain logistic regression to someone, they're like, whoa. That I've lost them from the beginning. I have to use things like examples. I have to say, Jason Kidd is an example of a player who couldn't shoot for a lot of years in his NBA career, who learned to shoot. He's one counter example. Yes, we may have 30 examples of players who are kind of like Russell Westbrook, and I could give them, I could list those for people, and then we can have a conversation. And hopefully, if I list the right things, and if we have a productive conversation, we can arrive at a conclusion that maybe is consistent with the model, or maybe they're coming up with reasons for why my model is wrong. And we all know models are imperfect. And maybe I can then come up with a better model. Maybe they're considering things, and there are things that are very difficult to put into a model. So having worked with a lot of smart people, smart basketball people, they will talk about eyes, ears, and numbers. And that's how you make judgments. That's how you make decisions. Your eyes see what's going on. They kind of react and everything to that. Numbers give you kind of a basis for everything. What ears sometimes do is they give you an idea for how these guys learn or don't learn. There are players out there who are really, really stubborn, and it's very, very difficult to convince them of it. There are players out there who may not be stubborn, but they're afraid. When you are the best at something for so long and you have to change your game, you're afraid to change the game and to change your own game. And how do you put that into a model? This right now is best coming from some of the people who do talk to the players and talk to their coaches and talk to their parents and some of the people who've been around them. And that's getting at more how some of these decisions get made. using eyes, ears, and numbers. That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, first, let's thank our speaker, please. This is fantastic. Let's do all the real cool little emoji things here. Yay. All right. Hey, thanks, Dean. Anybody have any other questions before we roll on out of here?
Yeah. What does a typical day look like for you, both on the road during the off season?
Off season is very different. Off season is more what I want to work on. During the season now, it depends upon whether it's a game day. So today was a travel day coming west, and so I did work on the plane. In particular, my work, we're playing Portland tomorrow. So putting together some things we have a person who leads our preparation for Portland, and I'm getting them some information on top of information that I automatically give them. And so I did that on the plane. Tomorrow we'll have a coaches meeting and we'll talk about our final decisions of what we want to tell the players. And then the coaching staff in modern COVID life, the way this works is that you have the head coach, you have the person who led the preparation for Portland, and then you may get the offensive or defensive coach in there as well. The rest of us can't be there because of COVID. But in normal years, we would all be in the same meeting. And then you talk to the players and you give them insight for what Portland's going to be like. You get a little bit of time in the afternoon to yourself, and then you go to the arena. There's a lot of changes of clothes in this job. I have clothes that I wear normally, and then you go to the gym, and then you got to put on the workout clothes that when you work out with the players, you sweat those things out, and then you got to change into game clothes. We'll have a last talk with the players about 40 minutes before the game, show them some other video, and then they go out onto the court about 10 to 15 minutes before tip-off to get their blood flowing. And I will, during some of this time, I'll be working on, there's preparation for the end of the game that I will do too, like post-game notes, that kind of stuff that I know what I'm looking for and that kind of thing. That's this season, and we have a lot of games packed together, so that summarizes a lot of what's going on. If we have days off, like yesterday was a practice day, it's a little bit different. We have practice in the middle of the day, but we're still preparing for opponents.
All right. Okay. Anything else?
If you don't mind me asking another question, how would you recommend getting started in a field like this? And do you know of any internships that would be a good opportunity to really get started?
Getting started in the field, I definitely recommend coming up with a problem based upon what you see in the game. If you like basketball and you watch it and you listen to some of the knuckleheads who are on TV, they will say some crazy things and they'll say it as truth. And you can say, is that right? And if you can do projects that look at that, you're in great shape. Post it on Twitter, post it on a blog. Twitter, basketball in general is a Twitter sport. People look on Twitter. People have gotten jobs via Twitter big time in basketball. So if you can do a study, great. And if you say, oh, I need data, I can tell you some of the people who've gotten jobs, what they did is they watched 5 games and they recorded the data that they needed. And they did good jobs. Otherwise, other times people were able to scrape play-by-play for NBA.com or from other sources, from ESPN, or they scrape data from Basketball Reference. There's a lot of places you can get the data. Do a project, publicize it, and you may have to do a few. That's a great way to do it.
All right. Well, that's interesting, actually. Any other questions? So it's kind of a make your own intern sort of thing.
Yeah, that's the way sports works. You definitely do it that way.
Well, let's all wish. We are all obligated to pull for the Wizards tomorrow for sure.
Definitely.
Thank you so much
Yep.
for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for coming. I hope everybody stays safe, has a great weekend, and we'll see y'all next week for the Math Club.
All right.
And Dean, thank you so very much.
Yep.
I'm gonna send you some email after a bit, but I appreciate it.
For sure. Good to see you after all these years. Yeah.
Oh, it was great to see you. It shouldn't be so long next time, and good luck in the game tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's stay in touch.
Sounds good. See ya.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.